Our final panel today brings us to the central question of governance and the way in which public policy decisions are made. Our two speakers will look ahead and deliberate on how our political system could evolve in the next 50 years. Our speakers are Education Minister for Higher Education and Skills, Ong Ye Kung, and the Executive Chairman of Banyan Tree Holdings Limited, Mr. Ho Kwon Ping. The chairperson for this panel is Ms. Deborah Soon, Chief Customer Officer of MediaCorp. I'll now hand over to Ms. Soon to begin the session.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome all of you again. Some of you are IPS Perspective regulars, and so you would have heard my introduction last year at the debate session, where I introduced the speakers by talking about how I first encountered them and my experience and what I thought or where we'd got to in our relationships. So last year I had the pleasure and privilege also to introduce Mr. Ho Kwon Ping, who was chairman of MediaCorp. So this year I have to do something different with him. And you all know, he's looking a little bit apprehensive now. As you all know, Mr. Ho is a distinguished business leader, philanthropist, thought leader in Singapore. So the way I'm going to introduce him today is to talk about how I recently met his son, or gotten to know his son, Renhua, better, because Renhua is now on the board of UN Women, and I'm also on the board of UN Women. I just thought it very interesting because, first of all, he's the only thorn among the roses on the committee, one of the first few men in the corporate world today to step up and say, we're here to support women's rights. I think it says a lot about Renhua and about Mr. Ho and his wife Claire, who need no introduction to this audience as well, that they have committed themselves to speaking up publicly for things they believe in, at the same time be thought leaders in their sphere and be business leaders. So that not only that, Mr. Ho and his wife have produced 3 children for Singapore, who also produced a grandchild for Mr. Ho and Claire. That's my introduction. And unfortunately for Minister Ong, since I'm taking that track, I have to thought about our first experience and encounter. Some of you may know, most of you will not know, that I first knew him when we were both at university a long, long time ago in a far, far, far away place. My enduring image, yes, he's also looking apprehensive now. My enduring image and impressions of him then were tied to this song I saw him dancing to at that point called Ice, Ice, Baby. It is a rather tacky song from the 90s, so those of you who are laughing, I know what your age is. Only those of us of a particular vintage will remember. Now, why I associate the song with him is that even in those halcyon days of our youth, Ye Kung managed to project an aloofness and confidence in the superiority of his views. No doubt they were usually right, they were, whether about economics or the political future of Singapore. But there was a way about him which tended to intimidate the other boys. Fast forward 2 decades later, I've had many opportunities to work with Ye Kung over the last 20 years or so, whether in the context of him as an officer in the Transport Ministry setting Singapore's land transport policy, as PM's PPS. Since I'm no longer a journalist or editor, my views are not so important, neither am I a historian or a politician. But I'd like to say that aloofness has softened over the years. Not only that, I think the ice has melted. When Ye Kung entered politics in 2011, none of us were surprised. It was perhaps a calling and a path which many of us expected. The loss in Aljunied was a temporary setback, and he has spent the last year and a bit since the 2015 GE more than making up for lost time. In my personal uninformed view, Ye Kung has learned the art of listening, persuading, and convincing, which is so important in politics. So I look forward to his contributions towards our country's future in both the intellectual discourse and in concrete outcomes in the years ahead, and of course, in the next couple of minutes. Without further ado, Minister Ong, please, on what could happen if Singapore becomes a 2-party or multi-party state.
Mr. Janadas Devan, Director of IPS, Mr. Mr. Ho Kwong Ping, my fellow panelists, Ms. Deborah Soon, moderator, and I shall not share my first impression of her. I do have a fairly deep impression of her too. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me here to have this very interesting discussion titled, What if Singapore becomes a multi-party system? I can, of course, make this a very boring session by insisting that we are already multi-party. I have friends who suggest that I take that line because they argue that every general elections, many parties contested, and therefore we are a multi-party system. But I figured that would be a cop-out, and if I really do that, you should ask for your money back. So instead, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is the PAP, which I represent today. The scenario painted to us is that by 2065, will the big elephant be replaced by maybe several smaller elephants that, through contests in elections, take turns to govern by itself or through coalition. It will be a drastic departure from the status quo, and maybe it doesn't even need to wait till 2065 to happen. But half a century from now, anything can happen. The question is, what happens then? I will make my remarks in three parts. First, I will explain that many things will change, but also in many ways, we will adapt, and I think life will go on. That's one. Two, notwithstanding that life will go on, I will explain why there are significant long-term risks for a small country like Singapore in a multi-party system. And third, given all these risks, I will ask as a Singaporean, what is the government going to do about it? I'm glad you spotted the irony. So first, what will change and how will life go on? I think a major change in a multi-party system is that the political ground will shift. We will have to expect a lot more jostling on the ground. Different parties reaching out to different groups, trying to garner their support. The unions may not be as cohesive as it is today. Today it works with the PAP in a stable, symbiotic relations. It may split into two or more groups, like in the olden days, or older days, where we have NTUC and we also have SATU. Likewise, we should also expect split affiliations amongst various groups, associations, clans, societies, arts groups, sports groups, recreation clubs even. Media houses can be split too. I wonder which way ST, Chaopao, Berita Harian will go. And it's not a new phenomenon. This has been the case, actually, in the hotly contested constituencies. You see, in 2011, when I didn't manage to win in Aljunied, I found myself becoming the opposition party in Aljunied. So in Aljunied at that time, I have supporters, and so when they organize events, they will invite me as the guest of honor. On the other hand, there are many other groups too that will invite the Workers' Party MP as the guest of honor. But most will invite both of us. And we'll both turn up, and I got a feeling the guests at the event actually quite enjoy watching the jostling between us. And in a multi-party system, essentially that will happen at a wider scale throughout the country at events behind the scenes. But I believe the institution that will be most tested will be the civil service. The holy grail of the civil service is to be politically neutral. Serve whichever government comes into power, since they are the one with the people's mandate. So civil service offer the policy options, articulate the pros and cons, and let the political leaders with the mandate decide. And the civil service will support regardless. It is a professional ideal but in practice, I think it's easier said than done. Because you can work on one set of policies for 5 years. Then someone new comes along and say, let's redo everything or undo everything. We see that now happening. Affordable health care in the US is now being repealed. TPP put to a stop. So civil servants are humans too. When that happens, and if it happens at a frequent rate, it can be frustrating and it can be very demoralizing. So it is useful to see how other countries deal with it. America, many of you will know, it ends up politicizing several levels of the bureaucracy. So whenever there's a change of administration, the top few echelons of bureaucracy are all changed out, which is why the Trump administration has to appoint 4,000 new bureaucrats. The alternative is the Australian or the UK system, where all the civil servants in the ministry, they stay intact. But the minister have an office that is quite well staffed. And I presume staff with civil servants that is more aligned to his or her thinking. So in Australia, when I visited, I had a strong impression, which is that the ministers spend more time with his staffers in parliament, as opposed to spending time with civil servants in the ministries, because the political contest is in parliament. We will have to adapt to all this, but it also means the status quo as we know it will change. But adapt we will. Second, I will touch on the real long-term risk for Singapore in a multi-party system that I think is beyond adapting. The risk is not so much being in a multi-party system per se, but what are the forces and what are the processes that bring us there? For a two or multi-party system to take shape, there must first be a partisan line, two different paths for the country to take. Some of these paths is like a fork in the road. They diverge, but they can come back together again. Sometimes it's also a T-junction. I turn left, you turn right, and we will never meet. You take the UK, for example. Around the mid-90s, we see the emergence of New Labour. So the New Labour and Conservatives, the Tories at that time, they both believe in pro-business, open market economy. They believe in equality of opportunities rather than equality of outcomes. Both eschew labour unrest, protests, strikes. That was a major shift for New Labour. The key divergence in policy between the two parties at that time was perhaps their attitude towards the European Union. And that position and that difference has now enlarged into those that believe in Brexit and those that believe in Remain. And that difference today has split the UK society based on rural versus urban residents, based on more or less educated residents, based on young and old. In the US, the key historical difference between Democrats and Republicans was slavery. Slavery is now no more. The situation has evolved. And so the two parties hold distinct views on the size of government, on taxation, control of guns, abortion. Different values. But in the recent presidential elections, those positions have widened, pitting nationalism against globalization, whites versus other races. It was a bitter, divisive election that both candidates openly acknowledged. Political parties are essential in representing the diverse views of the people they represent, and elections are necessary and peaceful discourse in finding compromise, finding a common path forward. And this is the essence of democracy. But the same essence can also take a nasty twist, sowing discord, dividing society. But that's why Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government, other than all the other forms of government that has been tried before. 50 years from now, if we have a multi-party system, what will define the key political difference between parties? What is the partisan line? If it's really about social assistance, the degree that we fund social assistance or fund healthcare, I think is something we can manage, and the pendulum will swing over time. But what if it's something a bit more sinister, or a lot more sinister? Dividing down race, language, and religion. And we know that politics and race, language, religion is a toxic mix. If we moved into that position, we will be broken as a country and as a society. Another major risk is whether a multi-party system will slow down our decision-making and our nimbleness in navigating an ever-changing world and environment. If we have imagine if we have a multi-party system back in 1965, will we have come so far so quickly? Back then, we could move to attract FDI, foreign direct investment from MNCs, when the politically correct thing is not to do so in a post-colonial era. In the turn of the century, in the 2000s, we sought omnidirectional free trade agreements with many like-minded partners, when many countries actually just pledged allegiance to the multilateral system of the WTO. And today, we need to embrace digital technology, even though it can be uncomfortable and disruptive. So if we envisage a future of tough challenges, challenging demographic trends, shifting political or geopolitical landscape, more intense competition internationally, rising sea levels, unity, common purpose, and the ability to move faster than others will be a central advantage Singapore has. While other countries may be slow but big, or small but fast, will we end up having the worst of both worlds, small and slow? The current system has worked well for the majority of Singapore and Singaporeans. It still gets my vote as the best system for Singapore. So, thirdly, given all these risks, what can the government do about it? To answer this question, let me rewind back to 2011, when I was first introduced as a PAP candidate. I was then asked by a journalist, what do I think of a single-party system? I said that, and I still believe in that, is that our equilibrium as a small country may well be a single-party system. The party may be PAP today, but it may be some other party down the road, so long as it is the most capable party to serve Singaporeans. Because the reason is geographic. For Singapore, between Changi and between Jurong, I think voters can think differently. They may have different views, but the views cannot diverge as large as, say, between New York City and Alaska, or between Jakarta and the eastern and westernmost places in the Indonesian archipelago. In those countries where they're so huge, geography separate people with different point of views, different outlook in life, different priorities, and then different political affinities, which then lends itself to multi-party politics. The single party in the case of Singapore, therefore, is not a prescription, but I think a likely outcome as a result of choice and of free and fair elections. It is not different from Massachusetts being dominated by Democrats, not different from Scotland being dominated by Labour and until recently, SNP. Smallness and concentration often do come together. So the answer to this question is regarding what are we going to do about it, is to make sure that the current system continues to work for Singaporeans. To do so, we must understand what factors make it work so far. Complacency, elitism, corruption, I think they are not inevitable outcomes for single-party rule. These ills have shown up across all political systems. The PAP knows that our integrity must be unquestionable. Something goes wrong, the perpetrators will be taken to task, and action has to be swift. We must be a party that's open-minded and keep up with times and circumstances, in line with the changing expectations of the population. That way, we must always be in the forefront of new ideas. Never think that today's solutions are the best solution that they can be. Keep our eyes and ears open to changes in our surroundings, consult widely, improve upon our co-creating skills, work together with the citizenry in creating solutions. We must attract talent from as diverse a background as possible. That is why every term, the PAP replaces a quarter to a third of its candidates. And the PAP must constantly self-reflect on areas that it has not done well, question why the Singapore dream did not work out for some Singaporeans. Our policies must be rooted in the ground. A sizable proportion of our work must be on the ground. And in this age of inequality, ours cannot just be a system that rewards the best and brightest, but also a system that compensates for poor family circumstances and the role of luck. Every country in the world is different. A country's success is always idiosyncratic and can never be replicated wholesale by another. The formula for success is based on different political processes, and ours happen to be a one-party system. Ultimately, the political future of a country will be determined by the will of the people. If the people wants to change to a multi-party system, it will be so. The job of the opposition parties is to point out the risk of a single-party rule. That is their job. But the job of the PAP is to make sure that Singapore continue to flourish. We will also point out the risk of a multi-party system. And most importantly, we must always keep out the ills of complacency, elitism, corruption. So whatever the what-ifs, single or multi-party, amongst all parties and all Singaporeans, we need a singularity of purpose and a wide agreement on the means of implementing this purpose. This is not mere politics, but it's about our collective journey as a people, as a country, to improve the lives of yours and mine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Ong. Now it's my pleasure to invite Mr. Ho Kwon Ping to address us.
Good afternoon. First of all, I must congratulate IPS for either being extremely prescient or simply purely lucky, and I suspect it's pure luck, for having chosen a topic without knowing at that time that the topic of what if, given what's happened 3 days ago with the inauguration of a president that was almost surreal, the topic of what if is certainly very topical today. So unless the director was extremely prescient, but I don't think you were, because I think you actually lost some bets because you actually thought Donald Trump would lose. But we are sitting here today in a really opportune time to discuss totally unthinkable, improbable scenarios that if they can hit America, certainly they can hit Singapore. And that's with my congratulations. The second part is not congratulations. It's a bit of a complaint about IPS, that having had the courage, presumably, to organize a conference called What If, you shouldn't be so disingenuously bland about the topic. As Minister has said, what if Singapore becomes a two or multi-party system? Well, obviously, unless you think we are Cuba or we are North Korea, which I do not think the IPS would dare to venture to think that we are already a multi-party system. So I think what you're actually saying, without wanting to openly say it, but which I did say in my S.R. Nathan lectures, I'm calling it the elephant in the room issue, and that issue is the PAP likely, or may it actually lose an election in coming years? What would be the consequences of that, and what might lead to that? And by the way, my lectures have been made into a book. Please go and buy it, because if you don't, Janadas is making me buy it in order to get back whatever money they put out for it. Now, in terms of the real issue then here, is the PAP likely to lose an election? Will we have a so-called multi-party system, meaning the PAP being voted out of power? Now, obviously, that is a scenario the PAP itself has really long considered, which Mr. Lee Kuan Yew foresaw, as those of us who remember at the time when he brought it up. He called it a freak election, where an electorate may, in his view, unintentionally and irresponsibly vote out the PAP. His solution, of course, was to create the elected presidency as a check against what he called a quote-unquote rogue government. Now, ironically, of course, many of us know that the law of unintended consequences always applies, And now the possibility of a rogue president might be even greater than that of a rogue government. And it's a headache which is presumably being resolved very quickly now. And it's a very fascinating issue, which all of you in the room know about, but it is a digression from the topic today, so I shall say no more about it. But the question here today is another one. It's what if a freak election is not, as PM Lee Kuan Yew had said, a freak event, but instead becomes institutionalized, and Singapore does become a pendulum democracy. And by that I mean the difference between us as a multi-party system and most other liberal democracies is that they have a pendulum democratic system. A pendulum system of two major and many minor parties, but two major parties who alternate in power between one and the other. And that pendulum provides the steady, sustainable, almost dynamic political equilibrium for a country for a very long period of time. So that has been generally the model of most liberal democracies, to institute a pendulum democracy. And if that happens in Singapore, is it good that we have such a system? Is it neutral? Is it bad? And how likely is this going to happen? Now, a traditional liberal would welcome such a pendulum democracy as a sign of progress towards full participatory democracy. After all, as I said, Western liberal democracy has as one of its touchstones the concept of a two-party pendulum democracy as the bulwark for long-term sustainable political governance. But however, as Donald Trump, as Brexit and other recent events, including in the rest of the EU, have shown, faith in traditional Western liberal democracy has been severely shaken enough for it to be no longer the yardstick by which political maturity or sustainability can be measured. A more universal and comprehensive yardstick, in actual fact, is no longer pendulum democracy. It is the quality of the social contract between a political leadership and its body politic, regardless of whether the formal political structure is a two-party pendulum democracy, a monolithic communist regime, or, as in the case of Singapore, a single-party dominant system. And the depth of that social contract, and by implication, the political legitimacy of the ruling elite, depends on a complex and yet subtle blend of factors for which successive Chinese dynasties since eons ago have coined their euphemism, and that was the mandate of heaven. Should that mandate of heaven, which is nothing more than political legitimacy, ever erode beyond repair, no amount of two-party or multi-party democracy can save a political regime or a ruling dynasty. And traditional pendulum politics does not by itself guarantee genuine participatory democracy. The present crisis of liberal democracy and the lurch of many countries in the West now towards extremism and populism is pretty eloquent testimony of this depressing reality. Against this backdrop, then, the critical question facing Singapore in 2065 is not simply whether an accidental freak election or a sustainable pendulum democracy should or might occur. It is about whether the social contract between elite governance and the body politic can become so strained and frayed that a crisis of political legitimacy may thrust unexpected extremist scenarios ranging from rule by a military junta or unstable coalition governments to actually become reality. In other words, what might happen to get us from where we are now, pretty much a bastion of political stability, to the uncertainties now plaguing the rest of the world. Let me ask and then answer three further questions in pursuit of this issue. First, what events could lead to such a massive loss of legitimacy or confidence in the PAP or the current political system? Second, what are the chances of these events happening? And third, is a two-party pendulum democracy a likely, stable, and sustainable option? Or alternatively, what might realistically evolve instead in the specific Singapore context? Let me address the first question in a rather circumspect manner by alluding to other Asian democracies. The closest, though imperfect, parallels are India and Taiwan. In both countries, the founding party of the nation, the Indian Congress Party and the Kuomintang, who were worlds apart, both in their leadership, personalities, and in their party structures. The difference between Nehru and Chiang Kai-shek were worlds apart, but both of them as founding leaders possessed an unquestioned legitimacy. After their passing, their offspring, Indira Gandhi and Jiang Jingguo, succeeded them, albeit with some lapses in between, but after them, the party leadership and the party itself started its decline. Three identical things happened in both parties. First, nepotism prevented the rise of younger, meritocratic elites vying within the party for ascendancy, resulting in sycophants all clustering around the dynastic heirs like in some archaic monarchy. Second, the values, policies, and the solutions which led the founding party to success became sacrosanct, sacred cows which could not be questioned even if their relevance started to wane. A sense of political complacency settled like fine dust over even the internal insurgents and overcame any impetus towards internal change. And third, a culture of entitlement led to endemic corruption, both political and financial, the final blow in both of these parties' inexorable decline of legitimacy. Second, should that fate, which has befallen almost all founding parties in electoral democracies over time, should that fate affect the PAP in coming decades, we will have the scenario for disruptive change. The second question is a follow-up from the first one. How likely is this to happen? The short answer, in my view, is not very likely. Brackets, I hope. In the next quarter century, or about 20 to 25 years. Beyond that, I think no one knows. Now, why do I choose 20 years arbitrarily? To some people, it may be too optimistic for some, and if it's too pessimistic for others. I chose this time span, broadly speaking, because I do assume that under our present system, and that even when Mr. Lee Hsien Loong retires, under the system that we have now, he will assume the mantle of minister, mentor, or senior minister, and the cohort of leaders whom we currently have will remain like tribal elders to guide successive leadership teams, not so much in specific policy making, which they do not need to do so because our future leadership, whoever they are likely to be all AMP graduates from Harvard and president scholars or generals and so on, and would know all the minutiae of policy making. But we will have to have the guidance in the preservation of the political values, the self-discipline, and the vision, which congeals into a lasting political culture. History has shown time and again that the values of a founding political culture can usually be transmitted with vigor down 3 to 4 political generations. Beyond that, complacency and entitlement usually overwhelm the messianic urgency and the self-discipline found in pioneer values. One can only hope that future PAP leaders, after the current leadership has passed from the scene, can learn from history. And in that sense, they will have a few definite advantages, not least that being, as a young nation, a new political culture of anti-corruption, meritocracy, multiculturalism, did not have to battle the centuries of deep divisions which afflicted, say, for example, Indian civilization when Nehru came to power. But at the same time, as Sri Lanka's civil war has shown, a relatively short period of self-serving political opportunism and populism can spiral out of control very rapidly. And who is to say, from what we've already seen, with a descent into opportunism in even mature and developed European and American societies, that our future leaders will be so self-disciplined as to eschew even a shred of self-interest, especially if their popularity starts to wane. As for nepotism, there are no current signs of this happening with the Lee dynasty clinging to power or promoting only its relatives. As for corruption, anti-corruption has now become, thankfully, not just a government policy, which it was in the early years of Singapore, but it has become a fundamental value of our people entirely. As for sticking to sacred cows, I think our government has also shown that sacrosanct policies can be questioned and can be overturned if they're no longer relevant. And so I remain, to use that cliched phrase, cautiously optimistic. But that is to some extent whistling in the dark. When I was a student in Taiwan in the late 1960s, one could not possibly have imagined the decline of the KMT and its future electoral loss, or the rise of the radical DPP within just a few decades. But it did happen. And who is to say it cannot happen here? Now, the third and possibly most intriguing question is whether the scenario leading towards pendulum democracy in Singapore is in fact the most desirable and likely long-term outcome. And if not, what are possible alternatives? Here we have a conundrum. History has generally shown that despite recent events in the West, that a pendulum democracy does offer a more sustainable, dynamic equilibrium than a single-party dominant system, which has no competition and falls generally into complacent entitlement. On the other hand, to move from the generally well-governed stability of our current single-party dominant system to a pendulum democracy implies that a massive loss of legitimacy by the ruling party has to first occur. That is certainly not desirable, and of course, currently not even likely, given the current robustness of the PAP and the weakness of the opposition parties. The danger of a single-party dominant system is political ossification over time, as a sense of entitlement encourages the nepotism, the complacency, and the corruption, which inevitably did lead to the demise and eventual re-emergence, of course, of even the most idealistic founding parties in so many places around the world. Therefore, one viable alternative is possibly to institutionalize policy competition and to deepen internal democracy within the PAP, beyond just secret elections to a central committee or Politburo. Now, several very different Asian political parties, from Japan to China to Vietnam, they already have intra-party competition through competing internal factions or cabals being endorsed by tribal leaders and so on. And it does produce a reasonably successful succession process where competition allows the most capable and the broadly competent leadership to emerge. But because this is generally informal, it's subject to backroom intrigues, horse trading to the benefit of influential kingmakers, and most of all, it is only successful as a competition for individual leaderships, and it is not a competition for ideas within a party. An attempt to institutionalize a transparent internal competition process, not just for leadership roles, but between party caucuses, which represent different philosophical or policy tendencies, may in fact be an innovative and sustainable way to combat complacency in long-ruling founding parties. By itself, however, internal party competition cannot assure that a political elite will remain relevant to the needs of a changing population. On the contrary, civil society must be further empowered as a partner to strengthen the social contract and also as a check against inept or corrupt governance. And this involves nourishing civil society players with that lifeblood of robust discussion, freely available and largely unrestricted information. This is one of the things I had advocated in the IPS Northern lectures, and thankfully it is happening. Information access is becoming easier and easier. And the notion that the less information to the public equates to the less the public can criticize, of course it's a natural universal bureaucratic impulse. It's slowly giving way to the realization that wide and deep access to information is a key measure of genuine participatory democracy. Access to information enables the public to robustly debate and articulate ground-up responses to the pressing issues of today. An information-rich society is all the more important since we've already seen how in the US elections, social media can easily distort facts and even manufacture disinformation. Our government was present enough to warn about the inherent flaws and the anti-democratic impulses of unfettered social media. But the preservation of any social contract that's beginning to fray cannot be achieved by instinctive knee-jerk clampdown on social media, even if it were possible in the digital age. The solution can only be not in more regulation and censorship, but in more citizen watchdogs monitoring falsehoods and pointing these out. Lies can only be destroyed by the sunlight of diverse and plentiful sources of the truth. And so, in conclusion, 2065 is a destination for which the journey is fraught with uncertainties. The simplistic notion which traditional liberal Democrats have long held out, that a pendulum form of democracy would solve our problems, it's not necessarily the most desirable, nor even the most likely scenario. On the other hand, the conundrum is the track record of continuously ruling founding parties has not been good. So, how the PAP can reinvent itself with the benefit of historical insight to ensure robust internal competition and also truly engage civil society in genuine participatory democracy will shape the future of our nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ho. Before I open the floor to questions, I'm going to ask both of you a question related to what you've just been speaking about. And you talked about robust internal competition within the party, within the ruling party, the PAP. What if the party fails to attract good people or sufficient good people to join them and to take up the mantle of entering politics in Singapore? The PM took 2 elections to build the core of the 4th generation team. And we are maybe famous 5, not super 7, which were the terms that we used to use in the past when there was a leadership succession change. The challenge is also that this team will have less time to get up to speed for 2020 when the PM has said he wants to hand over. What if the party fails to attract in the future more good people to join the party? So, to me, both of you, yes.
I would have to say that I respectfully do not agree with the notion that a country of our size, small though we are, and there are many other countries in the world smaller than us, I disagree that there's such a paucity of leadership that would not rise to the occasion. We do have a unique system of leadership selection in Singapore today, which is very unique. It is not one where there is much, how should I put it politely? Let me just put it very simply. I do not believe in the 747 theory of governance. Those of you who may be old enough as me may remember the 747 theory of governance. And this was when Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said at one time that if Singapore's leadership were all put into a 747 and it crashed, we would be forever gone. I think there is leadership in Singapore. There are many potential leaders out there. And I think part of the change that does have to happen within the PAP is more robust competition so that people can rise from below into leadership positions, rather than only a totally top-down selection process. That has to change. But I do not believe that Singapore lacks leadership. I believe it is out there. There are countries smaller than we are in population who have undergone huge crises. Leadership just comes out when crises occur.
Kang, please.
Like Gong Ping, I do hope that Singapore haven't gone so far. We have moved away from a 747 analogy, that out there among Singaporeans, with much better education, a lot more exposure and opportunities, we have a lot of talent out there in Singapore, outside Singapore, who has the capability, the integrity to be leaders, to be government leaders. The challenge, therefore, for the PAP is how can we be as pluralistic a party as possible, a party of all colors, take in everyone with different views, and then you can have a PAP today that is there are many PAPs in a way. You have the PAP of PM Lee Hsien Loong. You can also have a PAP of DPM Daman. You can have a PAP of Louis Ng, of Dennis Phua, or Patrick Tay, or Halimah Yacob. Everyone with a different bent, different objectives they want to achieve. And it must be broad enough a party to take in all of them. Inevitably, like what Kong Peng said, this will lead to internal competition, which I think will be a good thing. Today, I think it exists. There are diverse views, but the public don't see them. But perhaps, as part of our mastery of governance, this is something we ought to formalize over time. So, in fact, I think what Kong Peng raised, he never failed to come up with very interesting suggestions. And I think definitely it has to be carefully considered. Yeah.
So perhaps, since there's no lack of talent and there's an agreement here, the question should be, why is it at every election the party struggles to fill leadership positions? So I'll open the floor to questions after this.
But if I may just offer a short answer. The short answer is we ask, they say no.
And then, why? But okay, let me open the floor to questions. Professor Koh, would you have a question you'd like to ask?
I'm being volunteered. but I'm very happy to ask the first pair of questions. Before I ask them, I want to make a public confession that I'm a great admirer of both Kong Peng and Minister Ong. Kong Peng is brilliant, eloquent, super wealthy, and politically independent. Not as wealthy as Donald Trump, and politically independent. I think when Kong Peng is a bit older, he would make an excellent candidate for the elected presidency.
Soon.
Kong Peng, in the first of your 5 IPS lectures, you did a survey of the democracies of the world, and you observed that no governing party had ruled for more than, I think, about 80 years. Yeah? I think PRI Mexico had a longer tenure. At some point, a governing party loses its way, either because it becomes complacent or incompetent or corrupt, or all of them, you know? So, in your view, can the PAP be different? Can the PAP look forward to ruling Singapore forever? Or do you envisage that at some point, the PAP, like all the other founding parties of other democracies, will falter? And there will be a future in which a PAP will lose the general election. And do you see this happening within the next 10 years? I can't think of 50 years, next 10 years, next 2 elections.
If I may answer that, I already said I don't think it would happen when PM Lee is still around in whatever incarnation, as senior minister, minister or mentor, and so on. And I mean that quite seriously. I don't mean it facetiously. I think history will show you that the legitimacy, the charisma that a founding generation has, and the legitimacy that someone like Indira Gandhi had, and Mr. Lee Hsien Loong has, is very important. And I think that so long as he is around in one form or another, I think the party's adherence to its core values will remain, because he will still be hold of the torch, as it were. And as I said, quite importantly, it's not so much whether he is competent in particular policies. That's quite easy. Who is going to be the bearer of the torch of the values of the party? Who is going to be the one to say this must stop in terms of squabbling, that we cannot have this, we cannot have that? The values the political culture of a party, I think, is what, if you look at history, that is what has destroyed all founding parties. Not just the competency of their policies, but the internal deterioration of their own political culture. I do not think that will happen so long as Mr. Lee is around, because he has inherited all those values for which it has been in his DNA. I think the critical issue is what will happen 20, 30 years from now. And I do believe that the PAP has probably the best chance of any long-term political parties that have existed so far to possibly set a new record. Now, as to whether it can forever stay in power, I mean, I doubt that anything is forever. But given the PAP's ability to self-correct, given the PAP's ability to also always obsessively talk about problems, I think if there is an obsessive, compulsive focus by the PAP on the fact that after Mr. Lee is gone, that there are huge historical imperatives towards entitlement, corruption, and so on, and if they try to find mechanisms by which to innovate a one-party dominant system, such as institutionalizing internal competition for ideas, as I've suggested, I think we probably have the best chance of any country in the world to at least have a longer-term one-party system. But I don't think anything is forever.
Thank you. I had the pleasure of working with Minister Ong Ye Kung for about 3 years in negotiating the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. And from that experience, as well as from the experience of working with him when he was at Keppel, I have the highest respect for Minister Ong and regard him as a credible and leading candidate to be our next Prime Minister. So my question for Minister Ong is, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had in some of his writings and speeches said one day the PAP will lose power. No time frame on it, but one day the PAP will lose power. Do you share Mr. Lee's view that one day the PAP will lose power? And if you share this view, is it not in Singapore's national interest then to evolve a credible opposition party who can replace the PAP when the PAP falters? And if so, shouldn't the PAP modify its narrative that a two-party system may in fact be in Singapore's national interest?
Thank you, Professor Koh. I have to say, thank you especially for your confidence, but a lot of who I am today, I learned from masters, and I think Professor Koh is one of them. You should see him in action. So I hope you will write more books so that more people will learn your diplomatic skills. First question about Mr. Lee Kuan Yew saying one day PAP will lose power. I think this must be at the back of our minds, and all the ministers and all the MPs of PAP. It has to be at the back of our minds. The day that we don't think PAP will lose power is when we will lose power. I think that is when complacency sets in. We must always believe somebody better out there is going to win the elections and take over. And we therefore must continue to improve, be grounded, keep absolutely clean, and serve Singaporeans well. But in that case, then the second question is, shouldn't the PAP then nurture a credible party? My own sense, which I alluded in my speech, is that we are small. And therefore, probably a single party rule is the equilibrium in a small city-state. It may be the PAP today, maybe someone else, more capable later. For that to happen, I think there are a few possibilities for that to happen. First is that the PAP become corrupt, complacent. Then I would say it deserves to lose. And I have faith that if that really happens, and I hope it won't, there will be fine men and women who then form an alternative. But in that scenario, the PAP will deserve to lose if you are corrupt. The second scenario will be someone else, more capable than the PAP, comes along and win the mandate. And if that happens, I would say then that someone else deserves to win. So I would say there is robustness in the system, so long as we continue to identify good talent and try to engage them, sensitize them to politics, to governance, make sure good talent take an interest in the Singapore society, rope them in as much as possible. I think that is what gives the resilience to our system. It's the individuals that give resilience to our system, not whether it's 2 parties, 3 parties, and what is the structure of our political landscape.
Yes, I was just going to ask Minister to respond to your point about, but perhaps you want to go first and I'll ask him.
I was simply going to say that I think in terms of what I would like to probably see as the most desirable scenario is a system whereby we have this robust internal institutionalized competition within the PAP, and that when then either remains sustainable because the PAP through this internal competition is robust, or failing which the PAP splits into 2 because of the creation of two very coherent or more trends of thinking within the PAP. So if we had such a system, we have flexibility. If the PAP can contain the different tendencies of thinking within itself, it will go on as a one-party dominant system for a long time. If it doesn't, at least we then have the advantage of a breakup within a party of 2 different parties then, but 2 parties with leaders who have already probably had considerable time in governance and in thinking about the issues of governance. So to me, such a solution allows the flexibility for us to remain one-party dominant or to break into a 2-party system.
So let's pick up that point about the split within the PAP, which has been talked about before, and also on the other point, which Mr. Ho brought up, which is that as long as Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong is around in the political landscape, he thinks there should be no problem of the PAP going corrupt and losing its values and losing its way. How would you respond to that? Because ostensibly, you would still be around, and we would still be around as the 4th-generation leader when PM leaves the political scene.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to that. In his speech, Kwok Peng said he thinks it will be stable in the next 20 to 35 years, which means I'll be 68 to 84. Quite long. So I think it's beyond my retirement age. So I think...
Which might get extended by then to 70.
Yeah. Which is still beyond my age at 84. So I think what Kwok Peng said is right. When we have strong leaders like Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and then second Prime Minister, Mr. Goh Chok Tong, and now PM Lee, they have the aura and the authority to hold the party together despite different views. And I think that was essential for our stability. Of course, then, what happens to the next team? I'm supposedly in the next team. I would say in the next few years is actually quite a severe test for the new team that is emerging, that we have to learn from our seniors. We have to have this, make sure that the tribal knowledge will be passed down from one generation to another and learn as much while they are around. But when the day they retire, how do we then ensure that we have the bond with the rest of the party members, with the people, to continue to hold everything together, while ensuring that the PAP is as pluralistic, as diverse as possible. I think Kwok Peng himself also alluded to the answer. On one hand, having an old sage is very useful. On the other hand, the sense of things being unfair, that everything's kept within a dynasty, can also set in. He mentioned Nehru, he mentioned Congress Party. So a change of generation is actually an opportunity for a new team to build a new bond with the party, with the rest of the party, with fellow Singaporeans. I think that is really the key test. Next 10 years, I think, will be quite critical, whether we succeed or we don't. But we will have to succeed.
Thank you. Question to the young gentleman over there.
Good afternoon, Minister Ong and Mr. Ho. My name is Darian. I just finished my national service. Minister Ong, you conjured up two images, one of parties traveling along convergent roads, like the Tories and New Labour in the 90s, versus that of parties traveling in opposite directions along a T-junction. My question is, looking ahead, do you think that the future political landscape in Singapore will be more akin to convergent roads or T-junctions?
We have potential for both. The truth is we have potential for both. And both are possibilities. And we certainly don't want to be in the position of a T-junction. Especially, that means one's going left, one going right, and you will never meet. And if that divergence is defined by race, language, religion, I think it's very toxic. And we can be broken as a society and as a country. So, where possible, when we talk about multi-party politics, we must understand that parties don't exist just like commercial world. No, different products are sold in the market. In politics, multi-party exists because of partisan line. I mentioned earlier, between Tories and between Labour, there is a partisan line. Today is very much defined by their attitude towards the EU. In US, likewise, there's a partisan line between guns, between abortion, between God, between big government versus small government. So what is the partisan line for Singapore? Today, we look at all the political parties, I think we have a very broad center, which is why we still have a single party system. Because it's not so easy to discern what is the partisan line between the different parties and PAP. Even in WP, the recent presidential debate, for example, actually I was quite glad during the parliamentary debate, the WP agreed that we must safeguard the reserve. So a similar position as the PAP. They also agreed that whoever safeguard the reserves ought to be generally elected ought to have a general mandate, which also agree with the PAP. The only thing they disagree with was that they prefer a Senate, whereas we prefer a single elected presidency. So you could see that it's not a huge divergence, which means politics at the center is still working. So long as politics at the center is still working, we'll have a stable environment. And that is more important for Singapore.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. Dr. Gamin.
Thank you, Deborah. My question is for Minister Ong. Suppose the unthinkable happens, lots of unthinkable things have happened in the past year, and the PAP does lose an election. Well, I don't think it will happen very soon. I agree with everyone else. But suppose you do. We know that the PAP thinks long-term and thinks for the interests of Singapore. And you also do a lot of scenario planning and you talk about black swans. So if this happens, has the PAP got a plan in place to handle it? Perhaps you could share that with us. I also want a secondary question, which is there's a lot of interchange between the civil service and the PAP. A lot of our very good ministers were former civil servants. What will happen to the civil service then?
All right. So the question is, if the PAP loses, what is our plan? Okay.
What is your backup plan?
What's our backup plan? Yeah. We allude to Brexit and the election of President Trump as black swans, unthinkable. On the other hand, if you think about it logically, it should not be totally surprising. There are many reasons that people gave for these unexpected election results. It defied all the polls, but since when is polls totally accurate in the first place, right? But you think about it carefully. Ever since global financial crisis, incomes have stagnated in all these countries. I read somewhere in a report, the US, 80% of the population have stagnant or falling incomes since the global financial crisis. UK, 70%, France, 60%, Italy, beyond, higher than 90%. So when you have the masses unable to progress, I think they will seek a change. They will seek a drastic change. I'm glad in Singapore that has not happened yet. The masses was able to grow together with the economy. Ever since the global financial crisis, we continue to grow, and it's inclusive growth. I believe that Singapore voters are actually very rational. I believe every vote, every elections, they vote very rationally. Even when they voted out the PAP in alternate GRC, I think that was a rational choice. I think there was a rational choice to inject competition into the system. Residents of alternate thought through it. I think this is our political culture today, and I think we go back to what we said earlier. So long as PAP continue to be pluralistic, bring in different people, have a diverse group of talent, stay clean, never be complacent, ground our policies in the community, in society, serve all Singaporeans, I think the logical choice will continue to be exercised.
Mr. Ho, would you like to say something to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that if you look at history, again, very often when a ruling political party loses an election, what happens is that the entire leadership, which generally is quite old, moribund, and intellectually feeble by then, and that's why they lost the election, would generally be driven from power internally. Then you would have young Turks within the party who would come. And that whole infusion of fresh blood would generally result in that previous ruling party that has lost its power very often coming back into power again. And that's happened countless times. Of course, there have been cases where the demise of a ruling political party has led to long-term irrelevance. But very often, a loss reinvigorates a ruling political party that has lost its way. And that's sometimes the not bad, not necessarily unfortunate consequence of an electoral loss. It allows a reform of the party from within.
Yes, Gillian, please. Anybody else would like to stand at the mic and cure? Be great. Yes, I know later on as well.
Thank
or
you,
else
Ms.
I would think it's my fault and nobody wants to ask questions.
Thank you, Ms. Soon. I wonder if I may draw the Minister out on this question. He talked about the pluralism that exists in the PAP, but also probably the lack of really distinct policy choices that would create differences between the PAP and any other party. So my question is, looking forward to the future, since we spent the day talking about policy choices, what are some of the hardest policy choices in which the PAP will have to have that internal competition? We talked about the very difficult geopolitical conditions that we face, a choice which we hope we don't have to make between the US and China, or strengthening maybe this area as a zone of neutrality so that we don't have to make such choices. Is this a question that animates our leaders today, or will they, the 20-somethings in PAP? Another question we posed ourselves is, what about the issues of race and religion? We know that we've come out, as you have referred to it, a very heated debate about how we can refine our elected presidency so that our racial minorities can feel they are represented in that office. What are some of the very difficult decisions that have to be made on these questions going forward that you feel, Minister, will animate the leaders of the PAP? Otherwise, you leave room for other parties to play. Thank you.
Minister?
Okay, questions for me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. What are the hard policy choices? As you were asking the question, I jotted down a few. I would say this will probably be very important issues next few years. First, shifting geopolitical landscape. US, China, what if their relations is not good? Are we forced to choose? No, that's a tough one. Creation of wealth versus distribution of wealth. Sometimes, often it's not the trade-off, but sometimes it can be framed as a trade-off. Globalization versus nationalism. Do you lock, as President Xi has said, do you lock yourself in the dark room or you open up, as President Deng Xiaoping has said, let in the flies and the sunshine together? Singapore identity versus ethnic identities of all our different races. You know, how do you strike a balance between the two? The important thing is not to think of this as extremes, that it must be two separate parties, one stand on one extreme, one stand on the other extreme, and you have competition. But I think is to be able to bring in different sensible thinking talent that can work through these trade-offs and find compromises going forward. And I think that has always been the formula for us to find a way forward. It has always been about compromises, about finding win-win ways of moving forward, like creation versus distribution. If we don't create wealth, where do we get wealth to distribute? But on the other hand, you can't grow at all costs and ignore about income inequality. So always find a middle path. I think there are plenty of middle paths to choose.
Mr. Ho, what do you think will be the most difficult decisions or most difficult issue which a future government will have to confront in the next? Yes, I'm segging way.
The most difficult questions the government is going to have to confront in the next. Clearly, I think we've got one of them right now. I think the Minister alluded to it, and in our foreign policy, if the animosity between the US and China increases, and we are caught in the middle, as we obviously are, and if we are made to be an example, if Singapore succumbs, it will be a great coup for China, for far more than our size. We are going to be a demonstration for China. And I think this is something that, as we all know, discussion about choices is actually occurring in all cocktail parties, private dinners, and so on. There is no such discussion openly. But this is something that's just simmering below the surface. And it could be probably the first major crisis for Singapore in the post-Lee Kuan Yew era. And I think it's going to be a very difficult path for our leadership to navigate through. Obviously, I think all of us, it's in all of our interest that we navigate through this well, but they will require, I assume there will be differences of policy within the PAP, as there are already differences of policies even among all Singaporeans. There's a limit to how much we can have open debate on this because it's so extremely sensitive, but it's going to be probably one of the first big tests for Singapore. And I'm not sure whether in the resolution of this issue, there could also be signs for how we can, as a country, solve issues in a collective manner with some degree of debate.
Thank you. Zainul?
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you. I'm a Sufi by nature. Sometimes I believe that one has to lose oneself to find oneself. So my question is actually, which I think Minister Ong touched a little, but I'd like to ask in a different perspective about electorates. But before that, I'd like to say that I share the sentiments of Professor, my guru, about Mr. Ho and Mr. Ong for our future. Thank you. When the PAP lost 12% votes in 1984, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew then called all the editors and asked for feedback. And we were very blunt and brutal with him, and he was a very good listener. And then the whole thing swung back. And 2011, when we lost, I think together, Yi Kang and myself, I made this remark: we lost, but I hope Singapore gains. So my question is, do you think Singapore has gained by that loss, especially when you look at 2015, when the vote swung back, the pendulum swung back, and PAP got 70% of the vote, nearly 70% of the vote. What does it say about our voters? Is that a real reflection of the kind of voters we have, or do you think the pendulum will keep swinging back and forth? And in fact, people are saying that next round, watch out. Thank you.
We have to watch out at every round, right? I know. Simple question is, we lost, did Singapore gain? I would say yes. You look at after 2011, I think many policy shifts took place. Pioneer Generation Package, silver support, enhancements, building up of a much more rigorous program to build HDB flats for the young, many policy shifts. I don't think then the gain is in the 2015 election results per se. We got the 70% unexpected results as well. So I think it's basically voters looking at between 2011 and 2015, the party and the government has done a lot of good. They're beginning to agree that the direction was correct, and they gave the mandate, a stronger mandate, to the PAP. I think that was the simple reason why there was a swing. But I think the greater benefit is that the ruling party, at least to the PAP, is having tasted the defeat in Aljunied, and that everyone just understand that there is tough elections. Tough elections in Singapore do happen. We can lose GRC. We can also lose our mandate and never take anything for granted. That lesson now going, I think, has seeped into all our MPs, all our ministers and cadres, and I think that is the greater gain for Singapore and for PAP.
Okay, one last question, Professor Kishore.
Thank you. Let me begin by saying, by the way, that this has been a truly fascinating discussion, and it actually reflects how far we have come in Singapore, because I think even 10 years ago, many of the subjects we're discussing openly could not have been discussed as openly as we're doing so today. It shows a degree of political progress in Singapore that I'm happy to note. At the same time, I must say that while we've been talking a lot about political parties, and I think it's important to focus on parties, I think something more equally important, more fundamental, is political culture. And here, I think what's missing in the Singapore debate is that it's always either you have a PAP rule or you have the Anglo-Saxon alternative or USA or UK. But I just came back this morning from Switzerland, and I used to find Switzerland a very boring country. But I must say the boredom of their political system is such an asset, because it's guaranteed them 700 years of peace already. So is there something we can do to create a kind of a boring political culture in Singapore that ensures that doesn't matter which political parties come and go, at the end of the day, Singapore will remain stable?
Who's that question for?
Both of you, I guess.
I think for both of you.
Yes. Mr. Ho, would you like to go first? And then we let Minister.
Kishore, don't you think we are as boring as Switzerland today in our political culture? And thankfully, we don't have direct referendums for everything. I think your question was half facetious, so I can only reply half facetiously that I think maybe we should start a new index. We've already won everything in the world in terms of competitiveness, in terms of best city, cleanest city. We could maybe start an index and rank #1, or always just compete with Switzerland and ourselves for most boring political culture. That can be another feather in our cap.
I think be very careful of index. They never really measure what truly matters, often. I lived in Switzerland for a year. And I thought it's quite exciting. Every few weeks you have a referendum. You get enough signature, you trigger a referendum. How exciting. But I think but I'm glad, Kishore, you raised this example. It just shows that even though we are both fairly small countries, we are very small, they are a bit bigger, we chose quite different paths. For them, a direct democracy, rotating presidency, and in our case, try to have a solid, competent, clean, hardworking, single-party rule. Each country will have to find its own solution. As to whether it should be boring, actually, that's my preference too. I wish politics is more boring. And then we can focus on our lives and do something exciting for ourselves, for our family, rather than channel too much excitement into politics. But that actually doesn't so much depend on the political system or structure, but I think depends on voters. Whether voters, what do they subscribe to? If voters feel that all-out competition, intense competition, taking extreme positions is what they want to see Singapore, and I think voters will choose ultimately through general elections and move Singapore towards that direction. If voters feel that so long as we have a good single-party government with some competition at the side, keep it on its toes, some seats going to opposition parties, having all kinds of checks and balances to keep it clean, keep it hardworking, and then I can go about my own life, then I think it will shift us towards this direction. In the end, voters decide.
Thank you very much, Minister Ong. Good luck to you on your boring future political journey. And thank you very much, Mr. Ho, as well. And good luck to your potential boring political journey. Ladies and gentlemen, please, round of applause for our speakers.